The Supreme Court case Dred Scott versus John F.A. Sanford, better known as the Dred Scott decision, decided March of 1857. Dred Scott was born a slave in Southampton County, Virginia in 1799. He remained a slave in Virginia until he relocated to St. Louis, Missouri with his owner in 1830. In 1832, Dred Scott was purchased by an Army surgeon, Dr. John Emerson. They relocated to Fort Armstrong, Illinois, where Dred Scott served as a post physician from 1833 to 1836. Illinois was a free state, and he could have declared his freedom at any point while he was there, but for some reason, he did not. In 1836, they relocated to Wisconsin, where slavery was illegal, and Dred Scott worked as a slave there from 1836 to 1838. While he was in Wisconsin, he married Harriet Robinson, another slave. In 1838, he relocated to Louisiana, where he stayed with his owner until 1840, when they relocated back to St. Louis, Missouri, and he stayed with his owner's wife while Dr. Emerson was deployed to Florida for the Seminole War. Dr. Emerson died in 1843, leaving Scott and his family to the widow, Irene Emerson. Scott and his wife worked for 3 years as hired slaves, with all money they earned going to Irene Emerson. Dred Scott wanted to buy his freedom, but Irene Emerson refused to sell him to himself, leading him to seek justice through the courts. Dred Scott went to court for his freedom and was declared free in 1850 by the state court. However, in 1852, the Missouri Supreme Court reversed that decision, and Scott was no longer a free man. Irene Emerson later left Missouri and passed control of Dr. Emerson's late estate to her brother, John F.A. Sanford, a resident of New York. Scott's lawyers filed a suit against him with the U.S. District Court because he could not be sued in Missouri as his residence was in New York, and the case was later moved to the Supreme Court. The official cause for Dred Scott suing Sanford was assault against him, his wife, and his daughters. Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney had the most famous opinion in this case, even though it ignored precedent, distorted history, and ignored specific parts of the Constitution, such as the constitutional requirement that if one state considers an African American a citizen, all states must recognize his citizenship from Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution. He also voided the principles of free soil, territorial sovereignty, and every aspect of anti-slavery constitutional thought. He completely ignored the Missouri doctrine of once free, always free in relation to slaves, and he outraged the North by stating that African Americans could never be citizens of the United States. The official verdict of the case read as follows: enslaved people are not citizens of the United States and therefore could not expect any protection from the federal government or the courts. The opinion also stated that Congress had no authority to ban slavery from a federal territory. The South was overjoyed that the Supreme Court declared the Southern opinion on the subject of slavery as the law of the land and declared that speaking against it was morally treason against the government. The North, however, was outraged and exploded in denunciations of Taney's opinion and his use of tortured legal reasoning. Taney's hopes of resolving the issue of slavery versus freedom were smashed. If anything, the Dred Scott decision pushed the United States closer to the Civil War. For all practical purposes, Northern courts and politicians rejected Scott v. Sanford as binding. Dred Scott did eventually win his freedom and the freedom of his families after Irene Emerson married her second husband, Calvin Chaffee, an abolitionist doctor. He transferred her slaves to another man in Missouri so that they could be emancipated. Dred Scott, however, did not live long in his free life as he died in 1858 of tuberculosis.